Yo, what's good history fam? Today we're diving deep into one of the wildest stories in American history, and I'm talking about the story that started it all for the English in America. We're going back to 1607, way before your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were even a thought, to talk about Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English colony in what would become the United States. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why should I care about some old settlement from 400 plus years ago? Well, buckle up, because this story's got everything. Drama, death, survival against all odds, a Native American princess who actually existed. Looking at you, Disney. Cannibalism. Yeah, you heard that right. And a bunch of English dudes who had absolutely no idea what they were getting themselves into. This ain't your boring textbook history. This is the real deal. The uncut version of how America's first English colony barely survived and how it set the stage for everything that came after. So let's get into it. Alright, so picture this. It's the early 1600s in England. Spain's out here absolutely killing it in the New World, pulling gold and silver out of Central and South America like it's going out of style. They're getting rich, building an empire, and England's sitting there like, yo, we need to get in on this action. Queen Elizabeth I had tried to set up colonies before, but they all flopped harder than a fish out of water. The most famous fail? Roanoke Colony in the 1580s. That whole settlement just vanished. Like gone. We still don't know what happened to those people. Creepy, right? But by 1606, there's a new king in town, King James I, and he's ready to give this whole colonization thing another shot. So he grants a charter to the Virginia Company of London, basically a bunch of investors and merchants who wanted to make bank in the New World. Now here's where it gets interesting. These cats weren't sending their best and brightest. Nah, most of the dudes on this expedition were gentlemen, and I'm using that term loosely. We're talking about rich boys who'd never worked a day in their lives. Guys who thought manual labor was beneath them. They brought some skilled workers, sure, but not nearly enough. This is going to be important later, trust me. In December 1606, 3 ships set sail from England. The Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. On board, about 104 colonists, all dudes, ready to find gold, get rich, and hopefully not die in the process. Spoiler alert, a lot of them did not achieve that last goal. The voyage took forever, about 4 months of being stuck on cramped, stinky ships, dealing with storms, seasickness, and probably wondering if this whole thing was a massive mistake. They made a pit stop in the Caribbean, smart move, honestly, probably the last time they felt good for a while. And then finally, on April 26, 1607, they spotted land. They sailed up this river, which they'd eventually name the James River after King James, looking for the perfect spot to set up shop. And on May 14, 1607, they landed on this peninsula and were like, yeah, this is it. This is the spot. Plot twist. This was not it. This was actually one of the worst spots they could have picked. But we'll get to that. So the colonists set up Jamestown, named after King James, because of course, and at first they're probably feeling pretty good about themselves. They built a fort, set up some shelters, and started exploring the area. But real quick, reality came knocking, and reality was not nice. First problem. That spot they picked? It was in a swampy area with nasty, brackish water. The water was basically poison, full of salt and contaminated with their own waste. Imagine trying to survive while drinking water that's literally making you sick. Not a vibe. Second problem. Mosquitoes. Everywhere. And these weren't just annoying. They carried diseases like malaria and other nasty stuff that started dropping colonists like flies. Third problem. Remember how I said most of these dudes were gentlemen who didn't know how to work? Yeah, that became a major issue. Instead of planting crops and building proper shelter, too many of them were out here looking for gold and hoping to strike it rich quick. Dude, there was no gold, but they didn't figure that out for way too long. Fourth problem, the Native Americans. Now, let me be clear, the land the colonists set up on wasn't some empty wilderness. It was home to the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of about 30 tribes led by Chief Powhatan, whose real name was Wahunsenkaw. Imagine some random Europeans just showing up in your backyard and setting up shop without asking. Yeah, the Powhatans weren't thrilled. The relationship with the natives was complicated from the jump. Sometimes they traded, the colonists needed food desperately, and they had tools and weapons the natives wanted. But other times, straight up violence. Attacks went both ways, and the tension was always there. And then came the summer of 1607, which the colonists would later call the sickening time. Y'all, this was brutal. Disease, starvation, and attacks killed colonists at an insane rate. By September, more than half of the original 104 colonists were dead. Gone. Just 3 months in, and half the people who made the journey were in the ground. The survivors were literally starving, sick, and probably wondering why they ever left England. Enter Captain John Smith. Now, John Smith is one of those historical figures where it's hard to separate fact from his own hype, because dude loved to tell stories about himself. But here's what we know for sure. This guy was legit tough. He was a soldier, an adventurer, and he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Smith basically took charge, even though that caused mad drama with the other leaders, and laid down the law. If you don't work, you don't eat. Simple as that. No more freeloaders. Everybody had to contribute, even the fancy gentlemen who thought they were too good for manual labor. Smith also worked on building better relationships with the Native Americans. He led trading expeditions and, according to his own account, was captured by the Powhatans in December 1607. This is where the famous Pocahontas story comes in. According to Smith's later writings, and this part is heavily debated by historians, he was about to be executed when Pocahontas, Chief Powhatan's daughter, threw herself over him and saved his life. Now, some historians think this actually happened. Others think it was either Smith making stuff up or him misunderstanding a Powhatan ritual. We'll probably never know for sure. But what we do know is that Pocahontas, whose real name was Matoka, Pocahontas was more like a nickname, did become an important figure in helping the colonists survive. She was only about 10 to 12 years old at this time, by the way, not the romantic adult Disney made her out to be. She and her people traded food with the colonists, which literally kept Jamestown alive. Alright, so John Smith's leadership helped Jamestown limp along for a couple of years. Things were still rough, but at least people weren't dying at the insane rate they were before. The colony even got some reinforcements, more settlers showed up, bringing the population up. But then in 1609, Smith got injured in a gunpowder explosion and had to go back to England. And with him gone, all hell broke loose. The winter of 1609 to 1610 is known in history as the Starving Time, and that name doesn't even begin to describe how horrific it was. About 500 colonists were in Jamestown when winter hit. The Powhatans, who were fed up with the English by this point, basically laid siege to the fort. They surrounded it, attacked anyone who tried to leave, and cut off the colonists' access to food. Trapped inside the fort with dwindling supplies, the colonists ate through everything. First the livestock, then the horses, then the dogs and cats. When that ran out, they ate rats and mice. When that ran out, they started eating leather from their shoes and belts. They made soup out of starch from their shirt collars. And then, it got darker. Way darker. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts confirm what we really don't want to believe. The colonists resorted to cannibalism. They dug up corpses from graves and ate them. In one documented case, a man killed his pregnant wife, chopped her up, and ate her. When the other colonists found out, they tortured him and executed him, but that shows you how desperate and insane things had gotten. By the time spring rolled around in 1610, only about 60 colonists out of 500 were still alive. The survivors were basically walking skeletons, half dead, traumatized beyond belief. When supply ships finally arrived in May 1610, the newcomers were horrified by what they found. The colony was basically a graveyard. The survivors were so messed up that the new governor, Lord de Lawar, seriously considered just giving up and abandoning the whole colony. They actually started to leave. They packed up the survivors and started sailing down the James River, ready to say screw this to the whole Virginia experiment. But then, in a twist that seems straight out of a movie, they ran into another ship coming up the river. This ship brought news. More supplies were coming, plus more settlers and clear orders from the Virginia Company. Don't give up. Stick it out. So they turned around. Jamestown would survive. After the Starving Time, Jamestown could have easily become another failed colony, another Roanoke disappearing into history. But something changed. They finally figured out how to make money. Enter John Rolfe, and no, not the Disney version, the real dude. Rolfe was a colonist who arrived in 1610, and he had an idea: tobacco. Now, the natives had been growing tobacco for forever, but their variety was harsh and not popular in Europe. Rolfe experimented with seeds from Trinidad and other Caribbean islands, developing a sweeter, milder tobacco that English smokers absolutely loved. This was the game changer. By 1612, Rolfe had perfected his tobacco cultivation, and by 1614, he was shipping it back to England where it sold like crazy. Suddenly, Jamestown had a cash crop, a reason to exist, an economic purpose. Tobacco saved Jamestown. Within a few years, everybody was growing it. People were so obsessed that they were growing tobacco in the streets, in the marketplace, everywhere. The Virginia Company had to actually pass laws saying, yo, you need to grow food too, not just tobacco. John Rolfe is also famous for another reason. In 1614, he married Pocahontas. By this point, Pocahontas had been captured by the English, converted to Christianity, and taken the name Rebecca. The marriage was political as much as personal. It created a period of peace between the colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy, known as the Peace of Pocahontas. In 1616, Rolfe took Pocahontas to England, where she was presented as proof that the savages could be civilized. She was treated like a celebrity in London. But tragically, in 1617, as they were preparing to return to Virginia, Pocahontas got sick, probably pneumonia or tuberculosis, and died. She was only about 21 years old. Her death was heartbreaking, but her legacy lived on. She's remembered as someone who bridged two worlds, even though the real story is way more complicated and sadder than any movie shows. Back in Virginia, the colony was growing. The tobacco economy was booming. More settlers arrived, including, finally, women. In 1619, about 90 women came to Jamestown, and colonists could purchase them as wives by paying for their voyage, usually in tobacco. Not exactly romantic, but it did help establish more stable family life in the colony. Also in 1619, something else happened that would have massive implications for America's future. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. About 20 Africans were brought by a Dutch ship and traded to the colonists. Initially, their status was unclear. Some were treated more like indentured servants who could eventually earn freedom. But over the next few decades, this would evolve into the horrific system of chattel slavery that would define American history for centuries. 1619 was also when the House of Burgesses first met, the first representative assembly in the Americas. It was limited democracy, only property-owning white men could participate, but it was the beginning of self-governance that would eventually become a core American principle. So let's bring it home. Jamestown, established in 1607, barely survived its first few years. The colonists faced starvation, disease, attacks, and conditions so horrible that they resorted to cannibalism. By all logic, this colony should have failed. But it didn't. Through a combination of luck, stubbornness, tobacco economics, and exploitative relationships with both Native Americans and enslaved Africans, Jamestown survived and eventually thrived. The colony set the template for English colonization in North America. The lessons learned, both good and bad, shaped how future colonies were established. The economic model of cash crops worked out in Virginia spread throughout the South. The seeds of representative government planted with the House of Burgesses would eventually grow into American democracy. And tragically, the use of enslaved labor that began here would become central to the American economy and society. Jamestown also marked the beginning of the end for the Powhatan people. After Chief Powhatan died in 1618, his brother Opechancanough became leader. In 1622, fed up with English expansion onto their lands, the Powhatans launched a massive attack that killed about 350 colonists, nearly a quarter of the English population in Virginia. The English response was brutal. They waged war on the Powhatans for years, pushing them off their lands and destroying their villages. By the mid-1600s, the Powhatan Confederacy was broken, their population devastated by disease and warfare. Jamestown itself remained the capital of Virginia until 1699, when the capital moved to Williamsburg. After that, Jamestown slowly faded, eventually becoming abandoned and partly swallowed by the James River. For centuries, people thought the original fort was completely washed away. But in 1994, archaeologists rediscovered the fort's location and started excavating. What they found is incredible. The original fort walls, colonists' graves, tools, weapons, pottery, and even that evidence of cannibalism I mentioned earlier. The site is now a major archaeological project and tourist destination. So what's the takeaway from all this? Jamestown shows us that American history started with struggle, violence, and survival against the odds. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't noble. It was messy, brutal, and complicated. The colonists weren't heroes. They were often unprepared, stubborn, and made terrible decisions. But they also showed incredible resilience. The Native Americans weren't just victims or helpers. They were complex peoples with their own agency, politics, and resistance. Pocahontas wasn't a Disney princess. She was a real person caught between two worlds, used by both sides, who died tragically young. Jamestown reminds us that the origins of America involve not just European colonization, but also the displacement of native peoples and the beginning of African slavery, issues that would shape American history for centuries and that we're still reckoning with today. But Jamestown also represents something America loves to see itself as: a place where people came with dreams of a better life, faced incredible odds, nearly failed multiple times, but somehow pulled through and built something lasting. Love it or hate it, Jamestown is where English America began. It's the starting line for a story that includes 13 colonies, a revolution, westward expansion, a civil war, industrialization, world wars, civil rights movements, and everything that makes up modern America. Not bad for a swampy peninsula that nobody wanted and that nearly killed everyone who tried to live there. Alright y'all, that's the real story of Jamestown, the unfiltered and censored version they probably didn't teach you in school. From 104 hopeful colonists landing in 1607, to the horrors of the starving time, to finally finding success with tobacco and setting the foundation for English America. If this story teaches us anything, it's that history is messy, survival is complicated, and the roots of modern America are way more complex than any simple narrative can capture. Thanks for rolling with me through this deep dive into 1607. If you learned something new or just enjoyed hearing about our ancestors' wild struggle to not die in a swamp, let me know. Until next time, stay curious, question everything, and remember, we're all standing on the bones of people who survived impossible situations to get us here. Peace out.